Hey there, everyone. I'm Cassandra from CassandраTindall.com. I was going to call myself something else then, which is kind of strange. But anyway, here I am today with a dear astrologer, a wonderful person, a tutor from Nightlight Astrology. I'm sure you need no introduction, but welcome and thanks for joining me today, tutor.
Thanks, Cassandra. I'm happy to be here and hanging out with you.
Awesome. So the reason why I have invited a tutor on my channel, as you probably guessed, had a few guest astrologers on this program, on this channel, to promote their work in Australia's WellBeing Astrology Guide. So I invited a tutor to speak about his spiritual benefit, the spiritual benefits of astrology, and how we can get more out of our work as astrologers with astrology, but also from the client perspective. So before we dive into that, Acyuta, I'd just love for you to share with the people watching more about you and more about your work in astrology.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, well, it was a real pleasure to write for the magazine and to speak about a subject that's really dear to me. So, in addition to being a full-time practicing astrologer, I took monastic vows in 2019 and became a householding monk in the Bhakti yoga tradition. And so for people who don't know, that basically means that it's kind of like in India, you could be a monk, but not necessarily live in a monastery. You could be a monk and be married and have kids and live a normal life, but you're committing yourself to those regular vows and practices and so forth. So I was already 7-8 years into my astrology full-time, professional practice at that point. So what's happened over the course of my career has been a real natural interest in marrying together astrology with spiritual practice, whatever spiritual practice people may have, and trying to talk to people about how I see astrology benefiting the development of our inner lives. I think a lot of astrologers talk about this. I tend to link it really explicitly to yoga philosophy and things like that. I practice Hellenistic astrology, which is kind of like, ancient astrology, and it's becoming more and more people are becoming interested in it now, just like you are too. And but of course, like you, I also cut my teeth on modern depth psychology and archetypal astrology and evolutionary astrology. So I consider myself somewhat of a syncretic astrologer in that I blend modern and ancient form together, and then I'm always trying to marry it back to that underlying spiritual set of values or principles that come from my yoga practice. So that's kind of a little bit about me, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I guess the sort of angle or the intention that you have with your practice, it really seems to me it's going beyond the astrology, like the astrology with meaning, and how can that perhaps poke or prod or goad us towards going into a more spiritual pathway with it, rather than just kind of being bouncing around the planets like in a pinball machine, like, oh my God, this transit, and oh, this Mercury retrograde, rather than, trying to find, okay, what is the more underlining thing that is trying to be shown to me, or what does this experience, what can I learn from it, and how can I perhaps grow or evolve in a more meaningful way around it?
That's right. Yeah. And I feel like there's a few, maybe a few things that are easy to get swept up in when you're studying astrology. One is, like you said, like when it becomes, astrology is meant to be fun. So I don't want to make it sound like it's supposed to be this sterile, boring thing, but we don't want it to be the kind of thing that amplifies our anxiety about the future or our attachment, like a toxic gossip column to the events of everyday life. It's like I don't think we want it to be that. And yet it can very easily become that because it's powerful, it's real, and it's easy to get on the roller coaster of once you start learning a little bit, and then it's like,
totally.
So I think that's the first thing that we're prone to. And so I think it's important that we have a way of trying to address that in the way we teach or talk about astrology. And I think lots of astrologers do this differently. I kind of go through the yoga lens, but I see lots of astrologers trying to bring it back to, like, why are we doing this? And the second thing is that we also, I think, we have a tendency of thinking about the astrology in terms of not a lot of people do this, but I see this somewhat regularly where we're thinking about the astrology in terms of how can I take advantage of it to get something. And whereas I think when at least when I read what the ancient astrologers were saying philosophically, whether they were Stoics or Platonists or yogis or Hermetic philosophers or whatever, they were really trying to change their consciousness rather than trying to get a specific outcome. And you could say the change of consciousness is the outcome that they're looking for, and that's primary, rather than saying, okay, there's this transit's coming, how do I optimize it, like I'm trying to pimp my existential ride. So,
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I'm sure we've all been a little bit guilty of doing that sometimes, and I think
it happens.
Yeah. We could also, it's almost like having the weather map. Okay. Do I, take a jumper or sweater, or do I pack the sunscreen? You kind of can have an idea of, what you're moving into. Can be really that sort of forewarned is forearmed. But then, sometimes there is this thing, well, but what does it mean to go through that process?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do I come out the other side better or different or more wise than what I did when I entered it? And I think sometimes that's a question that we don't often ask ourselves enough. Do I get the wisdom from what they're, these grahas, they're pulling our attention towards something, and are we paying that? Are we paying that attention? And sometimes it can be a little bit of a, it's not an easy pill to swallow, is it? Sometimes.
Right.
It's a bit of humble pie in some respects.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And I think it's our willingness to stay open, almost like treating the planets more like they're inviting us into a really interesting relationship. And the unfolding of events is less like, what's going to happen to me and how do I take advantage of it? And more like, what's going to happen and how can I relate to it? How can I be surprised? What can I learn? And also how can I prepare? That's part of it too. But it's moving into, I mean, in the ancient world, right? These were the omens or signs of the gods. And so I think it's just shifting our view to, when the planets are showing their signs and they're showing up in our lives, it's really, we're trying to remystify the cosmos and re-enchant things and have this sacred connection to our experiences. And so I try to talk about transits in a way that's like kind of, feeding two birds with one hand. It's like, okay, how do we, here's what's coming and kind of prepare for it. But then also maybe trying to unpack different messages or lessons or insights and ways of relating to the process itself, as you were saying.
Yeah, it's very multi-leveled. Acyuta, can you talk a little bit about the article that you wrote for us and the story behind what happened with this particular client?
Yeah,
so you took it on an amazing journey of what someone came for versus what they ended up with.
Yeah, it was one of my most memorable clients. It was really inspiring for me to sit down and write that article for you guys, because I was really thinking, what is the spiritual purpose of astrology? And I thought, well, rather than harp on about it, let's tell a story, because that's really where you learn, isn't it? By living it and seeing stories from people. And
so much, yeah.
So so this woman came to me and she was really mourning the death of her husband, and she had a son who was living with her who was disabled, and she was, I would say, moving through, I think she was even diagnosed at one point with complicated grieving, I think it's called.
All right.
It's very, it's not your normal grief process. It's someone who's really, really struggling to let go and move on. So she, and the chart, I go through this in the article, the chart really very clearly showed it was a lot of planets in the 4th and 7th houses, home, family, marriage, and tight squares between these planets, difficulties with Mars and Saturn in the 4th house and stuff like that. And it was a very slow process of, coming in and basically just hoping that the astrology would tell her, okay, this is when it'll all go away,
Yeah.
and it sort of never did. In a way, I worked with her for many years, and it didn't ever really go away. And when it finally did go away, and I don't want to give like the whole thing away because the article's, I think, really fun to just go on the whole ride, but she ended up passing away. She's one of my only clients that has ever died while I've still been working with them.
Mm.
And when she passed away, it was very shortly after she finally got up the courage to sell her house, which she had lived in with her husband, and was a major step for her in terms of letting go in the grieving process. And the transits, everything was so beautiful to watch. And I went in thinking, well, I'm going to help this woman transform, and I'm going to help this
Mm.
woman change. And it was just this kind of stubborn experience of this grief that wouldn't go, but just bearing witness to it. And then the slowest, smallest change that eventually led to, okay, I'm going to sell the house and try to move on from where I lived with my husband. And then boom, she had a stroke and passed.
Mm.
And I just got this feeling that, sometimes we think about, I mean, I went through so many things with her, ups and downs. It had really nothing to do, with stuff with her son, stuff, whatever, her health. I mean, we looked at all sorts of different transits, but that one core issue just was there all the time. And it wouldn't really change. It didn't really go away. And when it did, she decided it was time to leave her body. And I got from that sometimes it's not that flashy. Sometimes it's just the slow process of watching a life change and watching a soul grow and watching
Mm.
a slow transformation occur, and just bearing witness to it, and the planets bearing witness to it as well, because they really tell the story in the article too, the planetary movements that happened through these years of working with her. And that just really moved me. It just, because every day, it's easy when I'm creating content every day, as you are and as astrologers are these days, to try to, encourage people and inspire people and pump people up about transformation and change. And there's a lot of that in the world, and a lot of it happens really rapidly and quickly. But also the planets are in it with us for the long haul, and some of the deeper, slower alchemical changes that we're going to go through that will be there, all the way until we're very old. And I think the planets are very, very patient. And so I think, in that article I was trying to get at is just the way that the planets are really helping us to understand the seasons of life and the companionship that we can develop with the planets through the seasons of life, even when the changes aren't very flashy, or they're not, things aren't always going to be dynamic and transformative in every moment and things like that.
Mm. Yeah, sometimes it can be quite confronting when we have these experiences. I mean, I have had a situation where I've had a client pass away in the midst of, working with them. And I think it happened just 2 weeks after our last consultation together. And it was, very confronting. And it does kind of maybe force you to think, more, beyond the, I guess, wheel of fortune of our life. Like, what is the higher purpose and the meaning, and what does it mean when someone is gone? You know what I mean? For their
Right.
soul and for the journey, and the ongoing legacy of that being. Like, it's very it's powerful, as astrologers, when it happens to us, or if it happens to us, and kind of encourages us to, I don't want to use the word detach, but also understand that there's more than just our day-to-day lives. You know what I mean? That there's
Yeah.
something bigger or more meaningful, or something it's an experience,
Mhm.
that is kind of, yeah, it's a real philosophical way to look at the moving planets and the way that they interact with us. But it also is a reminder in some ways that they are always with us.
Mhm. Mhm.
Mm.
Yeah, I kept thinking, for so many years of working together, I don't think I'm doing anything. I don't think I'm helping her. I don't, because it was just so hard for her to move on from this grief. And it was like a gravitational pull back to the same struggles.
Yeah.
And, in yoga philosophy, we say the same thing, that, you know, that there's certain recurring themes of suffering, of grief, of loss, of confusion, and so forth. And that we keep coming back to. And one of the things that was also amazing about her was she had a lot of guilt about using astrology, because she was raised Catholic and had a strong Catholic faith background.
Yeah.
And so she was using astrology unbeknownst to a lot of people in her life. And she had a lot of guilt about it, and would talk about that. And so one of the things that she said in our last session was that she felt like she was coming to accept that astrology was real. And this was because we had talked about transits that could coincide with maybe some bigger shifts with the grief. And sure enough, she had put her house on the market and sold it. And she was expressing a greater faith in astrology. And, for me, it was so rewarding to see that after so many years of working together. But then as boom, she leaves her body. And I was like, whoa, this is, and it just helped me. Yeah, like you said, it just helped me understand that I think we tend to think understandably in like, what's my 1-year plan? What am I doing this week? Because we're prisoners of the moment, and that's not a bad thing. But the soul perspective is also kind of like, what's your 500-year plan? Like because you're going to go, I mean, at least according to the ancient mystics who practiced astrology, the transmigration of the soul occurs after death. I personally believe that. Whether people do or not, I don't even think is necessarily important. But if you're going on after death, then, it just helped me understand that we're all growing and changing. And astrology is meant to help us see this life, both in the small everyday things, and then this big storyline that's a lot bigger. And it's so beautiful and mysterious. And that was just such a vivid example of it for me. And I didn't walk away from it feeling like I had a real clear answer about what this is the purpose of astrology, or this is the spiritual purpose of astrology. Only that astrology is meant to be it's a very special companion, and that it's there to help us deepen our spiritual life. And it's important to do so because the trajectory of the soul, this isn't the first time it's been here, and it's probably not going to be the last. And so astrology should help us to cultivate that sense of our lives as beyond just this particular incarnation.
Yeah, exactly. And there's something kind of bittersweet when somebody leaves their body, when they're at a point in their life where they should, in quotation marks, be self-actualizing, or what we would perhaps see as positive growth, or moving on and getting on with things, those sorts of things. Like a few months ago, my mum died, and it was at a stage of her life where she had from a sort of a materialistic standpoint, the everyday life, like all systems in place to fully actualize in a way that she had never had done. But it just wasn't available to her in the way that perhaps modern life said that she should have. And reading this article and, reading the story of this other lady, it sounded like she was in a similar situation where, like, right, I'm finally over the grief, I've sold my house, I can move on, and in whatever way, shape or form that takes place. But in some type of bittersweet moment, it wasn't the journey this time for her.
Yeah. That's first of all, I'm so sorry to hear about your mom.
Thank you.
I didn't know that. Yeah. Yeah. And I think it is similar. It's a way, I think, yeah, I mean, it was kind of like understanding that self-actualization is maybe more complex and mysterious and can go beyond this lifetime.
Yeah.
And that she did take this big step forward. And in some ways it was so clear. It was like, oh, wow, this is like a launch pad into her next incarnation. Maybe it's like hubris to say that, because who am I to say? You know what I mean? Like, I really don't know. But it was so profound. And it did make me think, we just don't know exactly how growth works, or how it's going to work, or how exactly how evolution happens. And she did all of the things that, all of us modern self-help gurus would tell her to do in order to be free and self-actualized. And
Yeah.
it led to it right afterwards. That was her time of passage. And
Yeah.
yeah, it just struck me of like, oh, we're in service to, like Auden once said, and James Hillman liked to quote, we're lived by powers that we pretend to understand. And
Yeah.
it's already tough enough. Thank God we have astrology
Yeah.
to help us understand just a little something, so that we can say that was a crazy experience, and we can then have this object of meditation. Okay, it was a Uranus transit, or it
Yeah.
was a Pluto transit, or whatever it might have been. I mean, that's really such a gift. And I think that's the spiritual presence of astrology that I think I was trying to get at in the article.
Yeah, the thing I love about working with the sky is that it gives us a sort of scaffolding of sorts to kind of contextualize or put a framework around the experience. Without that, it feels like maybe a constant wandering and questioning. And we still do the wandering and the questioning. There's so much more to astrology than, this aspect is going to be perfecting over the weekend or whatever.
Right.
But it does sort of help us to maybe have a bit of a foundation for the questions, or something to lean back into when we develop those relationships with the planets. And I don't know about you, Acyuta, but when I had the experience of my favorite client, I shouldn't say I have a favorite, but one of those people that book in and you're like, great, I just cannot wait to connect with them again and watch this massive progression that they were undergoing, and finally self-actualizing in the way that they were always hoping to do, but it just wasn't available to them. And you do go through this moment of obviously grief and shock and all the processes, but then you have to come back to the astrology and goes, what do I actually provide for people? And starting to not question like in terms of doubt, but trying to explore, as the article outlines, the spiritual benefit of it.
Yeah, totally. And it's, when you use the word like we're like wandering, and I can't help but think of the allusion to the wanderers. The stars were called wanderers, and of course that, but some people listening probably may not have heard this before, which is that in Platonic cosmology, in the Timaeus, which I think we have good reason to believe probably influenced some of the early philosophy of astrology, it was said that the secondary motion of the planets in the sky, the primary motion, the diurnal motion, carries everything round and round. And that's the rotation of the Earth on its axis for people who are listening here. But the secondary motion of the planets moving through the zodiac against the grain of that motion, it moves counterclockwise. Those planets called wanderers, or the grahas in Indian astrology, those wanderers were said to be a mirror of the wandering of souls sojourning in the material world. And that their movements somehow, as archetypal fields of experience, like mirror our own. And yet they set those movements into, they're held in a greater order. But the order is not just like order, it's beauty. It's like it's a music, it's an order like a musical scale. And I think isn't that kind of companionship is what we're getting at. We're wandering, but we look to the stars and we can see. That was the exact epiphany that my client had right before she sold her house. She was selling her house the last meeting we had. It was basically, I get it now. I see, like, this whole astrology thing is, she made that connection to where her wanderings in life she was seeing reflected in the astrology, and coming to terms with that was kind of an epiphany for her. And I think that's the same epiphany that keeps us so in love with astrology every day. Is it's like my wanderings are beheld in this larger, beautiful cosmic order. And if we connect with that regularly, there's a sense that even though we wander and we go through all of these experiences, we can really trust the nature of them somehow, even when they're painful, that we we can really trust that we're guided, and that there is some, well, the ancient word for it was harmonia,
Yeah.
that's the pervading reality.
Mm. Yeah, I always found it really quite curious that the word harmonia that we use, in the astrological sort of world, and in Norse culture, when we transition through our different lives, we, each sort of different faith, philosophy, and culture has its own version of it. But, my own heritage is Scandinavian. And so we have this thing called Haminga. And it is, their kind of maybe honor or reputation you accumulate through different lives. And I just always found that really interesting, that there is this, it's a continual connection to, the lived life, the next life, and, all of the things that, we trust is there, but there's no way really in our sort of modern way of being to prove it, or to reduce it to this kind of, dare I say, materialistic atheism way, which is, the antithesis of kind of the way we think as astrologers. And there was something else that you said that I thought was really beautiful when you linked it to music, like in harmonies and things like that. And it reminded me of a podcast I've been listening to about quite a famous Australian musician, and how he was this sort of he's this like musical genius who can listen to, several harmonies all at once. And sometimes the compositions that gets put together is too complicated. And, the business of music's like just kind of like separated out. And it reminds me of how we sometimes think as astrologers. There's all these various aspects of, perfecting, obviously this week in particular has been like that, a lot of harmonies going on at the time. And so sometimes, coming back to more of a spiritual purpose, rather than perhaps trying to pull apart these harmonies, or, like reduce the noise of the harmonies, it's more listen to them, feel them, experience them, and what does that bring to the soul when you hear those. And I think sometimes our astrology practice is like that. We try and intellectualize things so much in the head, but then it's also this philosophical felt experience as well. And it sounds like through the journey that you had with this particular client, she started to, listen to like feel the music as opposed to pull apart those harmonies.
Yeah. That reminds me of the song. I don't know if you ever heard the song by Brian Wilson from the Beach Boys called I Can Hear Music. Have you ever heard that?
I probably have, but it doesn't
I bet you if you heard it, you'd probably recognize
yeah.
it. But yeah, I mean, for me to feel the astrology, to make sure that my heart's staying in that space. And this is what I tell my students too. I say, I think it's important that you have some kind of embodied practice every day. Now, practice maybe sounds like too heavy or structured of a word, like maybe too Saturnian, but whether it's music or art or nature or exercise, for me, it's like my mantra meditation. My kids too, the creative space of playing with my kids and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Although, let me tell you, they can drive me crazy, but,
I'm in the same boat.
Yeah.
I only have one.
It's like, right. Yeah. So, but I think it's kind of like, I heard there's this I heard this one time from a friend. He's like a real sciencey guy. And he said that there was a experiment that was done where they had people with one hand, like the left hand, maybe, I don't remember what it was, drawing circles on a page, just like drawing circles over and over and over again. And while also trying to brainstorm like a creative solution to an idea or something like that. And anyway, the point was that by keeping the mechanical part of the brain occupied with like a task, like a linear task, like draw circles, that the problem solving capacity was amplified like really quickly. And it was just like so fast. And they were saying, yeah, it's like you have to, in order to enter this kind of flow state where creativity comes and intuition comes as readers, or you feel the transits more, or, whatever the case might be, just that embodied state you're talking about, that it's like, you have to be able to almost like put the part of the monkey brain, you've got to like
Mm,
put it into some kind of state where it's not taking the wheel too much.
mm,
And I think that's a challenge for us as astrologers, because it can be a temptation. What you're saying, as I understand it, is like getting locked into the analytical stuff of astrology. Oh, I've got 15 septiles, and I've got 2 quincunxes, and I've got 36 asteroids, and like none of which I have a problem with in
mm.
principle.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But we end up like paralysis by analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas really, like one of the things I love about Hellenistic astrology is that it has such kind of a more rigorous craft language, and that craft language for me is the equivalent of giving my hand the circle to draw.
Yeah.
And so it just occupies that, but it does so within a much tighter and more limited framework, so that I'm not also being overwhelmed by things. And
Mm.
it just kind of shuts my mind, that part of my mind, down, so that I can be more intuitive in the way that I read. Anyway, that's just kind of an aside, but I feel like
Mm.
whatever you do to get there as an astrologer, it's important. And I don't think it could hurt to pair astrology with something in your inner life that allows you to get
Yeah.
into that flow state.
Yeah, I loved what you sort of said about practice, even though, it sounded like it wasn't quite the word you were looking for. But what I often suggest, with clients in particular, is to develop some type of ritual. And then people might, lean into some type of religious thing or what have you, and think, oh, that sounds like a whole lot of hard work. And then you break it down and you go, okay, well, what is a ritual? It's basically
Mhm.
a routine with meaning. And
Yeah.
we can always look to our third house for that, for some guidance, in terms of what is it for you as reflected in your chart, where maybe you can channel into some type of routine with meaning that might then end up becoming some type of devotional practice. If you think about the third house is the house of the goddess, and sort of that divination process, and there's sort of the sextile to the ascendant also reminds me of what can you do that sort of supports yourself,
Mm.
and then also through supporting you as being in the sublunary hemisphere, then that reaches that ninth house connection. So it's almost like grounding something in order to get higher, which is obviously a contradiction, but it's usually the way. So if you're drawing that circle, it's like you've got the more physical body occupied, and then you can open up that channel in another way.
I love that way of looking at it. That is so nice. I never heard it articulated like that before. And I love that because, well,
Mm,
probably because I have my sun and Mercury and Cancer in the third, but then I have
right.
my moon and Cap in
Yes.
the ninth.
Mm,
So I feel like that just perfectly describes it. There's I think in the I Ching, hexagram number 20, which is called contemplation, it
mm,
shows the preparation for divination, but the divination has not been received yet.
yeah.
So it's like all the ritualistic activities, if you think about, I don't know, like the heating of the tortoise shell and the preparation of the ceremony and the flowers and the altar,
Mm-hmm.
and all of that stuff is so necessary for the space to be
Mm,
adjusted right. So the environment has to be right so that some lightning rod connection can be made between the above and the below.
mm.
Yeah, no, you've really got my wheels turning on that one. That was great.
That was my Saturn in the third. It's a routine with meaning.
I
So,
love that.
yeah, I mean, in my 20s, I've lived the majority of my adult life in a different city. And when I was living in Sydney, it's a much more multicultural place than where I am now. And most of my friends were Indian. So I went to all the Indian weddings and all of the different ceremonies. And I remember one friend, we went there to help prepare the ceremonies and all the flowers and everything. And I remember one of her grandmother was coming, and she was explaining to me, because I was like 20, 21, all in sort of the Hare Krishna phase of our lives. And every flower was positioned because it represented something.
Yeah.
And it had this everything, it just so spoke to my Saturn, that everything just had a meaning and a purpose, and it had a devotional quality to it. So again, like the idea of look to the third house, because I think the third house is probably one of my favorites, because it's so underrated. And it
Mhm.
can, whether it's getting up 20 minutes before the kids or before the rest of your household and sit out on your porch or your veranda, you know what we'd say here, and have a coffee, contemplate,
Mhm.
cup of tea, whatever. If that's what it is for you, go do it. If
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
returning to the yoga, you know, that sort of floats your boat once a week, you know, or
Yeah.
reading more, listening to music more. And when people sort of think about the things that they like to do, it's usually, you know, the music or the read. I don't have time to read. Well, make that time, you know,
Yeah.
like commit to it. And what
Mhm.
it gives you back is threefold.
Oh, yeah. So well
Mm,
said. I love that. And obviously that's we share the same background too, in terms of like you've had that connection to the Indian devotee community,
mm,
the Hare Krishna tradition. And that's obviously what I'm steeped in now. And I mean, the philosophy is easy for me to understand, but what I think what, you know, because I love that part of me, just I love philosophy, but um the embodied, like being brought in so warmly by so many Indian
mm,
friends now that I have into the cultural experience, the
yeah.
food, the smells, and I think that one of the reasons that I also spend a lot of time telling people to develop this stuff, ritual with meaning, is something I'm totally going to use now. And I'll make sure I tell everyone that you told me that. But um, you know, is that there's a lot of that missing in culture. Like, don't get me wrong, I think we have there's still a lot of great cultural traditions and stuff like that. But I mean, in
Mm,
terms of like and I think of the third house too, of the goddess, I think of the folk roots of everyday life, like a village or a,
mm,
you know, maybe tribal customs in an ancient sense or something like that.
yeah.
And it's like, you know, nowadays, I think one of the reasons that maybe the third house gets associated with like social media or you know, is because that's taking the place of those cultural
Mm,
spheres that are supposed to help create that kind of altar. Everyday life
yeah.
is an altar.
Mm,
And so it's, I think, you know, I think maybe unconsciously I hammer on it because it feels like sometimes it's missing. And I
mm,
feel that all the more now that I'm seeing, like, when I spend time with Indian people quite a bit now in my life, I'm like,
mm,
you just how steeped they still are in India in many ways. In other places in the world, in the
yeah.
West, it's just a little bit different. Western culture, you know,
Yeah.
wherever we are in the world, it's a little different. And so,
Mm,
and I love what you said similarly about Norse culture and mythology. And I think some of this also could be found by trying to go back to our roots a little bit. Like my wife right now, you know, she's got some a transit from ninth house Neptune to third house Saturn, and she's taking a course with her grandmother on folk tales and herbal remedies from like Sicily, because that's where they're from.
so
And
good.
so, you know, and so it's like she's trying to go back into that cultural,
Mm-hmm.
those
Yeah.
roots somehow. And but what comes out of it is not just like, oh, I heard some stories and learned about a culture. It's this it produces states of reverie that lead to creativity in your life,
Yeah.
and you know, the downloads start coming. So it's like we got to try to create that somehow, huh?
Yeah. In, you know, in more kind of, you know, I can really only speak from, you know, I guess, you know, where my lines come from, but I know in Norse culture that the women's primary role was to be the educators of religion, sorcery, and philosophy to the children. Like they were the teachers.
Oh, brilliant.
Yeah. And, you know, that was what they were solely responsible for the education of the children, and you know, the tribal laws or you know, learning about the gods and what have you. And I really do see that as an embodiment of, you know, the third house of the goddess. It's, you know, the learning, and to learn something you have to really devote yourself to it, you know, again, the routines with meaning kind of
Right.
concept. And so and I think, you know, I could totally go on a totally different tangent here. We were trying to keep this conversation a little bit more short, succinct, but seems like we could do a 3-hour episode at this
I
rate.
know, right?
But but there's this you know, I think, in, you know, not to upset any feminists, and I certainly don't want to take, I can look at these things from a philosophical standpoint. Doesn't necessarily mean I always want to embody them, but in some respects I see how that sacred role of the female or the mother or the woman has been a little bit we don't revere it in a way that we once used to. You know, the role of, you know, like I experienced this myself. I had my son, oh, so when are you going back to work? Or, you know, like there's all this, you know, it's like, well, I have a child, you know what I mean?
Right.
Like I'm his soul, you know, like I'm his mother, he needs me kind of thing. So it's this sort of sacred space of the third house that I think has been quite lost in our modern way of life, you know, reduced, as you said, to social media and things like that. It's lost that real goddess embodiment. So I do find myself speaking to the third house a lot with people when they feel like, you know, if they're having a significant Uranus transit and they're anxious or feeling lost or feeling like they've, you know, who am I? Or, you know, time is slipping away from me, or just like needing to reground. And I do find, again, you know, the idea of the third house, come back to those routines that have meaning, like
Right.
the you know, whether it's chanting in some cultures, whether it's the rosary beads, it grounds you down in order to connect, whether it's the drawing of the circle with the left hand. And you know, I love the third house. It's got my worst planet there, but I've learned to Saturn in a note chart, but I've learned to harness it. And again, it's that devotional quality of whatever it is that works in your life. So, you know, as per your chart suggestion.
Oh, yeah. And I think of like the fact that many in the East, of course, the sacred number of the beads is 108. And that's a lunar number. And I can't remember the reasoning behind why that's a lunar number, but and also what comes to my mind, and I'm just riffing off from what you said, is you look at the path of the moon, the circle, the great circle of the moon. It's serpentine, it's winding its way around the ecliptic, and it's waxing and it's waning. And it's a reflective light, you know. And so when I think about, like, in the Hare Krishna tradition, Krishna is represented by the moon as an avatar, like as God who descends into some temporary form, and or you know, comes and goes or whatever, descends and then leaves. And in that sense, the devotion and remembrance come together. And I think about moon and how it was connected to memory, for ancient astrologers, and the idea that most devotional practices are about remembrance. And a similar function, if I think about my wife, and she's her devotion to the children, the way that I see that. I mean, she's devoted to herbs as a professional too, so it's not like I'm trying to say it's just her as a mom, but because she's an herbalist. But it's that innate sense of memory and being tuned in and constantly in a state of devoted remembrance, and something like that is and I think that's why, you know, for me, with my son in Mercury and Cancer in the third, that I feel like I love this kind of stuff. You know what I mean? Like I just live and breathe those daily rituals. Whether when I was in my MFA program, it was my daily journaling and writing. And, you know, now it's my content creation, my process of like kind of preparing that and creating it every day and whatever. But anyway, I'm just riffing off from what you were saying and just loving it.
Yeah, I love how, you know, when you refer to the householder, and I'm really familiar with that term. And many moons ago, I used to work with a friend of mine in his chiropractic clinic, and I used to do the massage and the acupuncture there. And in his treatment rooms, he had like a framed sort of certificate, sort of, or a poem type of thing. And it was kind of like the laws of life when you're a householder, you know, obviously Indian. And it kind of gave these laws, or maybe not laws, but kind of like guidance for life, and, you know, the rituals of life. And the fact that the third house obviously falls away from the fourth house, and part of being a householder is such a sort of a revered space, or a sacred space, or almost a life path in a sense, and how the devotional side is adjunct to the householder's life, and they're intertwined, and they're succeedent, you know, they're parallel to each other rather in the
right.
in the chart. So they're very intricately linked. And I know myself, like, just, I think of, my own upbringing and, what routines with meaning did we have in that house? There was none.
Right.
And of course, as a very young person, I was, just literally, oh, wow, they, do these pujas and all these different type of things. And, everyone kind of gathered around. So I went, God, this is amazing. Like, I never had this. And,
Right.
yeah, it was just so much of this like devotional quality to it. So I think, when we're developing, the spiritual benefits of astrology and how can we try and get that, I think starting with the third house is just such a wonderful place to start. For some
Yeah.
people, it might, obviously dependent on, your sign, the planet that might live there, and the aspects it makes is going to speak to that. So I have Saturn, it makes Mars makes a very, very tight applying square. And for me, it's, powerlifting, lifting heavy
Ah,
weight.
yeah. Oh yeah. I love that. That's awesome.
Fixed sides, Mars and Taurus, Saturn and Leo, heavier the better. So, listening
Yeah.
to and picking up heavy metal is what I do. And that, just literally getting back into my body, because as astrologers, we can spend so much time in our heads.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
Well said. I love that too. I love that the Mars Saturn piece describes your daily ritual with meaning, and the metal piece makes total sense too. I love that. That's awesome.
And the creative ideas, I come, because obviously when you lift up something heavy and you got to like wait a bit but before you do it again, and it's in that waiting time, in the time in between, is where I'm like, oh, I could do this. Or you get these little light bulb moments going off in the
Mhm.
brain, about, something random astrologically related.
Interesting. It's so interesting that I got really into weightlifting as Saturn and Mars were squaring over the summer. That was what
Mm.
initiated starting where I started working with a personal trainer, because I'd done a lot of things on my own and just was looking for some guidance. And she just put me on this total, weightlifting routine that I'm doing now. And it is a total complement to my daily, my daily yoga practices now. And
Yeah.
so important that it be not just, because even spiritual practices can be a little mental
Yeah.
if they're not like paired with physical things. Like I see this a lot in the yoga community. We owned a studio for a long time, my wife and I, and like people would come in and they'd have like, okay, like really good meditation practices or whatever, but diet, sleep, and just like either whether it's cardio or resistance training or something, you have to, you also need to feel your body, because it's it's the, if you want to get it into the yoga philosophy, it's housing, it's a house of the holy, it's the place where the soul lives. And so if the body isn't right, it's like not going to make the soul very happy while it's
Mm.
here. And that's part of our duty, is to take care of it's like taking care of a temple. So yeah, so I think that third house, you could even see the moon was associated with the third house, the joy of the moon. And you think, well, the moon was the planet that was associated with the body too.
Mm-hmm.
So there it is.
And even the mind. So being able to sort of integrate those things.
Yeah.
Yeah, throughout my 20s, of course, the yoga was the thing, what I was quite devoted to. And then I figured like I wanted to up the ante and join a gym and never look back. And yeah, and I often kind of talk about astrology as being very yogic in its principles, in the sense that you can like learn the technique of astrology. And to me, that means, yeah, just shove your body in a pose. Anyone can do a downward dog or, whatever,
Right.
right? But when you combine the body with the mind and the breath, and then you can soften into that pose and go in deeper and stretch more and have for that moment, or, that experience of the integration of all of those concepts, that is what astrology is. Like you have to sort of integrate it into your life. And then you have these like flashes of insight, or these light bulb meditational, almost transcendental things like, oh my God, I just got what that thing meant, what my teacher was saying, or what have you.
Right.
But you can't just, and this is the challenge for students. And obviously you're about to start a new intake in your course. And I know I find that with my students, because we have primarily most of us would have learnt this sort of memorization or rote learning type of things. And if we come into astrology as adults, and unless we've had other type of sort of pathways of education, it can be a real grappling point to integrate the philosophical with the technical.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's like doing the pose or doing the breath and the meditation at the same time. And you've got to find that Jupiterian integration of all of those parts. And then you get the whole. And that's always greater than the sum of the parts. And so that's coming back to that spiritual component of astrology. Like, it's not like this one transit or this one funky asteroid that's just going to unlock the secrets of the universe for you. It's a journey and a process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the joy for me of studying Hellenistic in particular, is that it's this weird Rubik's cube where you've got if you want to understand aspects, you really have to understand planets. But if you want to understand planets, you have to understand the houses and the joys of the planets.
Mm-hmm.
You want to understand the joys, you got to go back to the thema mundi. And like, it's never in a vacuum. There's no component that you can learn without trying to understand the rationale of another component. And what's happening, I think, when we're studying in that way, is that connections are being made, and we're starting to see astrology as like a moving mandala. We're starting to see it like as the actual sky moves. You know, it's never actually static, even though we freeze frame birth charts. But we're starting to see this this picture that comes into view, and you get little glimpses of it, like you were saying, there little moments, and you can't help when you're doing that, because in order to do that, you can't help but understand the philosophy that is underlying it all. And the more you do, the more you understand that, oh, this is a profoundly spiritual thing going on here with astrology, you know. And then I feel like you have the same, a lot of times you have this, it's not like when you learn Hellenistic, it's not like everything you've studied prior to Hellenistic is thrown out the window.
No.
But it has a place that it didn't have before in the mind and in the body, and it has there's a deeper understanding that comes along with the signs, the planets, the houses, and everything like that. And then it leads to, in my experience anyway, it led to this fluidity of associations, and my like to be able to delineate charts and talk to clients, and it was very magical the way that it started changing my practice.
It's interesting how, you know, the nature of philosophy in itself and spirituality, it's like this circling, this wandering, and then you come back. It's such wonderful mind food. And it comes back to the idea you were saying that your wife is, you know, connected with her grandmother and learning from her, and the idea of going back to one's roots to discover something old but in a new way. And I think that's the beauty of Hellenistic astrology gathering popularity. And, you know, I think I first came into the idea of Hellenistic astrology maybe around 2005. It was still really, you know, new. And it's like, as astrologers, we're going back to our roots, you know, as we would do culturally, but we're doing that maybe as an astrological, spiritual component. And I think that's potentially one of the reasons why so many people are really feeling deeply connected to what it has to offer, because it is based in the roots of what we do.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll just share this story before we close.
Sure.
I was when I started to study astrology itself was much later. So like 2008, 2009 was when I just started studying. I didn't get to Hellenistic till like 2015, something like that.
Yeah.
So when I started studying, I was exposed, you know, to the work of Project Hindsight and Robert Schmidt and stuff like that, which is where a lot of the translation efforts, these ancient texts were coming back into the picture and so forth. And I found out when I was in Maryland that, oh, this guy lives not far from me. And so I actually went and ended up visiting with him a few times and talking with him and I was listening to all of his talks from Project Hindsight and gathering stuff like that. And around that time, I was also apprenticing with my guru for initiation. And I ended up visiting with Bob after a retreat, a yoga retreat. And on the way home, a friend of mine and I stopped in and were visiting with him and stuff like that. And he didn't look very good. Like it looked like he might've been sick. And after that talk, he invited me to come over and more regularly, like study and sort of like go deep together. And I was ecstatic. I was really excited. And, I went over the next time I was visiting, and I'll never forget, because I was talking to an astrological buddy of mine on the way out, saying it's so funny because here's Pluto's in my 9th house, opposing my sun in the 3rd, and I'm getting to meet this astrological legend and talk with him a little bit more. And a lot of people spent years. I mean, Chris Brennan lived with them for a few years. Demetra was very close to them, but here I am getting to meet them and talk to them a little bit, and I was so excited. And I got there and I knocked on the door, and no one answered. And then I called his wife's cell phone, which I had, and she answered and said that he had just had a stroke the previous night and was in the hospital, and that would end up being his deathbed.
Wow.
And so I went to the hospital that afternoon because no one was there with her even, and they were very reclusive, like scholarly recluses in many ways. And I went into the hospital room and spent some time with Bob, and prayed with him. And he could hear things. He had a stroke, and he could hear things, but he couldn't respond. He could like squeeze his hand, that he could just do that. And and I had that same experience. It was like, my client. It's like, I'm ready to study with you, like and I thought this big thing was going to happen, and now you're leaving. But in many ways, being there, and I ended up, helping. A lot of astrologers help, but I remember just kind of getting going with like a GoFundMe or something to help with the funeral expenses and stuff. And a lot of people probably remember that. And then talked a little bit at his funeral, and so much of that experience was very similar for me in terms of the feeling of like, this is the moment of self-actualization as an astrologer. I've met my astrological guru, or I'm going to study with him or something. And then he just has just left his body. And one of the things that I came to was, it was important. In some ways, it was not good that he left in any literal sense, but I see the lesson in it, because what he has come to represent to me is the spirit of going back to discover something and making it new again, like you were just saying. And the fact that I wasn't able to get more locked in, because he was kind of like a Hellenistic astrology is the real astrology. He was very a proponent of that. And some people didn't necessarily love that about his work. I loved it and had a hard time with it, but the fact that he left, in many ways, left me with all of the best stuff to take, and could leave some of the things that may not have worked. And it really was something that just made me understand the spirit of exactly what you said about ancient astrology. That's when I titled my course Ancient Astrology for the Modern Mystic, with the same idea in mind, that this isn't about Hellenistic astrology being the right and pure and best original astrology. It's about going back to our roots so that we can understand something more fully. But then the question is, what does it mean to us now? And what do we do with it now in this moment? And I don't think I could have had that insight if it weren't for that kind of aborted moment of self-actualization, so to speak, where I was like, oh, we're ready. I'm going to study with you. And then he just passed,
Yeah, that's interesting. I was about 1 year into my astrological studies when my teacher passed away very suddenly.
Gosh.
So then I had this moment thinking, maybe I'm not meant to do this, like, because, you're 1 year in and you're hooked, right? And then it's like, am I meant to do this? And I thought, well, I'll just be a naturopath, or I'll, do this, I'll do that. And so I was a bit lost for a while, but again, she gave me enough to plant a seed that I could get education from other avenues. And, there was around the time I, met a good friend of mine who was studying with Robert Schmidt, from Australia. And, he introduced me to the Hellenistic astrology met John Frawley. And then, so it was so wonderful that I was able to carry on something that had started, but in a new way, because my first teacher was very modern psychological. It was nothing Hellenistic at all. We looked at the essential table of dignities. Don't worry about that. And I'm like, this sounds really good. So yeah, it was, so I guess the idea is, endings can be very sad, but they can also be bittersweet and lead us to something new. And that, I guess, maybe not that that's the answer, but maybe that's the spiritual benefit of what we do. So Acyuta, this was a conversation that we didn't expect to have, but I'm so glad that we've had it and we've been able to share it with others. So with your Ancient Astrology for the Modern Mystic course, that is starting, I guess it's Saturday US time. So what I'm going to do is I'll pop a link in the show notes where people can find out more about that. Did you want to talk about that very quick, or did you just want to leave it to the link or give it a little plug?
Yeah, I mean, if people want to check it out, it starts on Saturday. It's a 1-year program in Ancient Astrology. There's about 30 classes. You can attend live or remotely. There's guest lectures like Cassandra. She came and gave one of the lectures in our series this year. We have breakout study sessions, tutors who are there to help. It's a great program if people want to dive into Hellenistic astrology really deeply, but with that sense of the integration of modern aspects of astrology as well. So yeah, people can just check it out, or my work in general on nightlightastrology.com. And
of course, there's your also, YouTube as well.
That's my YouTube as well. Nightlight Astrology. And I do, by the way, it's interesting because I'm just finishing my time. I've been very slow in finishing my apprenticeships with the correspondence courses with John Frawley that you mentioned. Yeah. And I absolutely love horary astrology too, which we didn't really get to talk about today, but that's maybe something apparently we have that in common. So we'll have to bookmark that and come back to it.
And it's interesting how we talk so much about the third house and the moon, and your astrological practice is literally nightlight.
Yeah. I didn't even know. I mean, I was so unconsciously just being my astrology because I didn't know astrology that well enough when I named my LLC back in 2010.
Wow. There we go. No coincidences, hey? And that's what's the amazing thing about the spiritual component of it. It's just, I don't know, some just connections that you make that so obvious, but you could never always plan for at the same time. Well, Acyuta, it was a wonderful article, bit of a tearjerker, I must be honest. If my memory serves me correctly, I think you might have even talked about this particular client in one of your episodes on your channel, right?
Yeah, there was so I don't remember which one. I couldn't tell you what it was called, but there was a time when I talked about the chart after she passed on my YouTube channel.
Okay.
And that was she just left this indelible mark on my psyche.
Yeah. Beautiful story. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in and listening to our lengthy philosophical conversation. It was great to connect with you all. And Acyuta, thank you so much once again for your wonderful work in the magazine and for your contribution to astrology overall. It's fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks, Cassandra.
All right. See you later, everyone.